This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. Now, whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. Now, exclusively for listeners of this podcast, you can use the code SKILLS25 and receive a 25% discount on all ebooks at newsociety.com. That's all one word and lowercase, SKILLS25 on all ebooks. So level up your knowledge today at newsociety.com. Hey there everybody and welcome back. So one of the most crucial natural environments for the health and stability of landscape hydrology are wetlands. They also happen to be areas of the highest density of wildlife and biodiversity when they're healthy and functioning well. Funny how those things go together. So at the same time, wetlands in all their different forms are highly endangered, being the targets for milenia for drainage and infill in order to make use of them for cultivation or development. Yet recovering and rebuilding wetlands is not only possible, it can be an affordable and context-appropriate way of regenerating the health of entire water catchments as well. Here to shed light on the topic of wetland construction and design is Tom Biebighauser, the founder of Wetland Restoration and Training LLC, which was established in 2014 with the mission of encouraging and helping people to build naturally appearing and functioning wetlands. Now, Tom had heard from many landowners and natural resource managers that it was almost impossible for someone to learn how to build a wetland, and that actually building wetlands was extremely expensive. And to make matters worse, the few people building wetlands back at that time were using techniques with a success rate of less than 50%. So Tom learned how to build wetlands, streams, ponds, and lakes the hard way through trial and error. Building his first wetlands in Minnesota in 1979 while working for the U.S. Forest Service, he has since built thousands of wetlands. Less than one half of the early wetlands that he built held water as planned, but over time, through much anguish and relentless work, he developed innovative techniques for constructing wetlands that are consistently 100% successful and low cost. So Tom Biebighauser has been enthusiastically restoring wetlands, lakes, streams, and rivers since the late 1970s. He has designed over 10,000 wetland projects and has successfully supervised the construction of over 3,000 wetlands and streams in 26 states, 3 Canadian provinces, Mexico, New Zealand, Puerto Rico, and Taiwan. Tom has developed highly successful and inexpensive techniques for restoring wetlands and streams that should last forever without maintenance and that provide habitat for endangered and threatened species. In this interview, Tom and I go into quite a lot of detail about wetlands, covering the range of configurations and biomes in which they appear, and how prominent and integral to landscape health they have been in areas that we now consider arid and degraded. We explore the criteria for selecting a wetland construction site, as well as the design criteria and process in order for it to fit well and function on the landscape. Tom also explains all the important maintenance and monitoring process once the wetland is installed, and we even explore the unique opportunities that exist to integrate wetlands into farms, schools, communities, and many other managed landscapes that have traditionally drained and dismantled wetlands in the past. This episode is going to kick off a series of water-focused episodes, some of which I'm bringing back from the archives because there are many new listeners who haven't heard them and they're worth revisiting, and new conversations as well, as I look into the specific context of water management challenges and potential here in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. Now, I also have some exciting announcements that I'll be rolling out at selected intervals throughout this series. It's still a little early to say or give details, but I can tell you that if you're passionate about supporting regional water restoration and the possibility of turning this type of work into a career, then be sure to stay up to date during this run. Now that's just a taster for now, so I'll hand things over to Tom Biebighauser. Tom, to get us started, can you tell me a bit about how you got into working in wetland building and restoration?
I grew up in Minnesota where there were wetlands and lakes everywhere you went. And I thought it was normal to ride my bicycle on a road that bisected a wetland area. And I found out later that wasn't normal. But there was so much water on the landscape in Minnesota that I also started trapping and hunting at a young age. And so I was out in wetland areas all the time trying to capture everything from muskrats to mink to raccoon to beaver and otter. And I saw many of these wetland areas being drained. There was so much drainage taking place in the 1970s and 1980s that I'd be riding my bicycle out to check a trap line, and I would see that a landowner would have a drag line or edge working, and they would be digging the ditches and they would be draining the wetland areas. And I thought, well, this is really, I'm not real happy about this because I love to watch wildlife and it sure is great to see wildlife. And here these habitats are being eliminated. So then I started working temporary positions with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and then with U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I learned more about how our landscape has been changed by drainage. And I learned that many of the large farm fields that we see, they were created by draining and by filling and by leveling wetland areas. So I started learning more and more about drainage. And I remember one position I was working with Tim Bremiker. He was a wildlife manager with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And he would send us out to sites to do inventory on wetlands and wetland life. And some of the sites he would send us to, we'd get out there and there'd be no wetland. And I'd say, well, Tim, your directions aren't very good. And he said, no. He said, there was a wetland there. I will show you where it is. And we would drive out into the countryside and there'd be no wetland. It would have been drained. It would have been filled. And then I started realizing how common wetland drainage was on the landscape and how almost every agricultural field we see that has soil high in clay, those areas were created by draining wetland areas. So I started thinking about how could we bring back these wetland areas and what techniques are available for doing this. And that's what started a quest and a career for me in wetland restoration and wetland creation and specializing in helping rare species of plants and animals. And lately, I've been helping more and more farmers, people who are interested in raising crops, how can they manage wetlands and help their farming operations? And that's pretty exciting.
That is really exciting. And that's a wonderful story. This passion for wetlands goes all the way back to your childhood. And I personally really remember growing up in that landscape where there's practically a lake in everybody's backyard. And, the downside of that, of course, is all of the mosquitoes associated with that much water. But I know we'll get to that in a minute because they're not synonymous with wetlands. But before we go deeper into this, can you tell me why wetlands are such important ecosystems and what they bring as far as services that we rely on?
Well, let's start simply. Everybody likes watching wildlife. I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't like to watch wildlife. If you want to see wildlife, you go visit a wetland area. I mean, people go to Florida. Why? I know all the amusement parks, but really all the wetlands and all the wildlife they see, especially in the Everglades. So wetlands are very productive. In fact, the majority of the endangered and threatened species in North America, they depend on wetlands for a large part of their livelihood. And also, wetlands are so important to us because when there's a flood, these wetlands capture water just like a giant sponge, and they hold it, and then that water slowly soaks into the ground, which is also so important because many of us drink water or use water from wells. And wetlands will recharge this groundwater and clean this water so that we have good, clean, safe drinking water. And wetlands are also important because they can help control erosion. And they're also important because of all the plants that grow in them. And wetlands sequester carbon. We're all concerned about climate change and global warming. Hey, the best carbon sinks anywhere are wetlands that tie up all these organics in their sediments and won't release them. So this is pretty amazing what wetlands can provide to us. And we know that in working along the ocean areas, and if people live, along oceans, they know how important wetlands are about controlling and slowing the storm surge and how important they are about reducing flooding in their communities. And people have built their homes near the ocean. If the wetlands are still there, their homes are generally protected during a storm. But if the wetlands have been eliminated, then unfortunately their homes are much more vulnerable to all the erosion that comes, with a flood event.
Yeah, it's true. That's one of the sad circumstances here in most of the Mediterranean. The wetlands along the coast have long since been drained, even going back to Roman times. And we continue to suffer the downstream effects of having removed those critical ecosystems.
You're right. I'm going to tell you about one of my strange hobbies, and I have several. This is collecting books on drainage. I think I've collected now almost every book that's been written about drainage and about wetland destruction. And I'm just fascinated by the topic. And you're right, the Romans did start a lot of this drainage, and they had a way of farming wetlands that they called lands, Lands. And I remember my grandfather talking about making land. And I thought, what does that mean to make land? Well, the Romans taught us this, that if you have a wetland area and you want to raise crops on it, you can rearrange the soil by creating these parallel beds. And they're called lands or raised beds. And then in between the beds are what we call dead furrows. They're not ditches, but they're where they borrowed the soil to make this land area for farming. And we see that pattern on the landscape, both in Europe and across North America. And it was one of the earliest ways of changing wetlands so they could be farmed. And some farmers still use the procedure today, but it doesn't work as well as all the other techniques that have been developed, especially in Great Britain and Germany. All these techniques that were developed for draining wetland areas. And they involved burying these pipes in the ground. Now, if you want to drain a wetland, you need to dig a ditch. That's the way you drain wetlands. You dig a ditch, and then that ditch eliminates standing water and it lowers the elevation of the groundwater so that you can raise crops. But if you dig a ditch, then you have to farm around that ditch. When you dig a ditch, you have to get from one side of the ditch to the other, and that ditch will actually block your field into two separate fields. So people learned many years ago, even during Roman times, that if you dig a ditch and you place rock in that ditch and then cover over that ditch, then you can farm over the top. And many people call that a French drain, but it's a rock drain. And then they also learned that if you put wood structures like boxes in the bottom of the ditch and then cover over the ditch, you can farm over the top. But then in Great Britain and Scotland and in Germany, they came up with these buried drainage structures made out of clay. They called them clay drain tiles. And those were first brought into the United States in 1838 by John Johnston, who emigrated from Scotland. And he started using these drainage structures, and they're very effective at draining wetland areas. And nowadays, we take plastic pipe with slits in it. We bury that pipe in the ground. So when you're out there looking at a farmed landscape, whether you're in Europe or North America, more than likely it's been changed greatly by these drainage actions.
Yeah, it was a huge thing that they promoted around the turn of the century and still goes on today. They're not using as much clay tile anymore. They're using more like plastic tubing, but it's still called drain tile in a lot of cases, right?
I know they still call it that. They stopped making the clay tile in the 1970s, and that's when the drainage pipes were invented, and they started getting quite a bit of use at that time. And now, if you see a farmer who's ready to drain, there will be these huge rolls of this plastic drain pipe, and it can be anything from 4-inch diameter to 6-inch to 8-inch in diameter or greater. But if you look closely at it, it'll have these narrow slits in it, even thinner than a piece of paper. And this is what's designed to pull the water in and carry it in the bottom of that covered ditch so you can drain the wetland area. So many people that get involved in wetland restoration, they think that all you have to do is to excavate a depression in the ground, not realizing that somebody's been there 100 years before them and they installed these buried drainage structures. And that's why we see many wetland projects not succeed as planned, because somebody's been there, they've drained the land, but the person who's restoring the wetland hasn't reversed these drainage procedures. And that's what I do with restoration, is that I assume that somebody's been there before me and they worked really hard to drain that land, and they were every bit as intelligent as I am, and I have to try to figure out what did they do to drain the area and then try to reverse that practice.
Yeah, I
And the
love some of
same
the
thing is true in
presentations and the videos that you have on all of the different practices like this. I know exactly what you're talking about from the presentation that you published, but
great.
it does make it tricky because, like you said, so many of these installations are below ground and you can't just see them walking onto a landscape. But you've developed some really good techniques for identifying the indicators as to whether or not there's drainage underground or if there have been some subtle canals put on the landscape. Do you want to go into some of those indicators now?
Sure. I can see the ghosts of drained wetlands wherever I go. When I'm driving down the highway, my wife has to remind me to keep my eyes on the road because I'm seeing all these drained wetlands. And the number one sign of a drained wetland is a ditch. And ditches can be deep with vertical sides, or they can be quite shallow with gradual sides. But if you see a ditch, more than likely somebody's tried to drain a wetland area. If you're driving down the highway and you see a vertical pipe in a field, then that's what we call a surface inlet, and that takes water directly into a buried drainage system. So that's another sign of a drained wetland. If you're driving down the road and you see a pump near a field, maybe you'll see a power pole with, an electric line, and then there's this little structure near a field. That more than likely that's a pump, and that removes the water from the ground so they can farm the areas. And then also, oftentimes in the spring, if the soil is exposed and the soil looks gray, that can be a sign that that was a wetland area. But I wanted to tell you about some of the work that I just completed in Arizona. You say that you live in Spain and that the landscape can be quite arid in places. Well, I just finished a wetland and a stream restoration project in Arizona, and it was at a place that we call the Dye Ranch, that's DYE, and this is near Payson, Arizona, and there were 4 small wetlands that had gone dry. And these were 4 small natural wetlands. They used to hold water, but they don't hold water anymore. And then there's a stream, and it looks like the stream used to flow year round, but now it doesn't flow, but maybe a few days out of the year. Well, I worked with Arizona Game and Fish Department, and our interest was to try to restore these wetlands so that we could have water for breeding by the northern leopard frog. Northern leopard frog is a rare species of frog. And so here we are on this arid landscape, and there's no water in these wetlands, and there's no water in the stream. What do? We applied for grant money, and it took us a lot of work in order to secure this grant money. And I think a main reason is people don't trust the techniques that are available. They don't believe that you can actually make water on an arid landscape. So what we did with this project is that we dug some deep test holes in the wetlands that weren't holding water. And I had dug shallow test holes, and I'd found that there was compacted clay in the bottom of these wetland basins. And this compacted clay would perch water on the surface. So when there was the uncommon rainfall or the uncommon snowfall, and that snow melted, then the water would pool in these natural wetlands. So the test holes I dug by hand only went down 1.2 meters, and we found clay, and the clay was compacted. And I thought, well, maybe it is climate change because, after all, these wetlands aren't holding water anymore, and Arizona has become drier and drier. Well, we brought in an excavator, and we had a team of people working with us, and I dug a deep test hole in one of the wetland basins that was dry. And I went through a little over 1.3 meters of clay that was compacted, and then I hit gravel. In the bottom of this test hole, there was creek rock, and the hole started filling with groundwater. And then we figured out what had happened on the landscape. For many, many years, there were so many cows and so many horses that were grazing that valley. And for so many years, these cows and these horses were compacting the ground. And there was a tremendous amount of erosion because of the number of animals that were grazing in this valley. And I talked to an individual that had lived there for years and said there used to be thousands of cows grazing on the landscape, and there wasn't a single green plant out there for them to eat. And when they did get a rain, there was a tremendous amount of erosion. So what we figured out what happened is that all of this erosion had filled the natural wetland basins. And the cows were so desperate for water that they entered these drying basins and they compacted the clay. And what they had done then is that they had covered the natural stream with over 1.3 meters of clay that was compacted, and that water in the stream was no longer able to make it to the surface. So our restoration technique involved removing the clay that was overlaying the gravel and releasing that groundwater. But then also we did something we call building a groundwater dam. We dug a trench across the valley at the lower edge of each natural wetland, and we dug that trench down into clay that was located beneath the historic stream bed. So looking
you
at
went
layers
below
here,
the gravel to find another clay layer?
yes. So
Okay.
we had a sandwich here is that we topsoil on the surface of the basin, and then we had this 1.2, 1.3 meters of compacted clay, and then we had roughly 30 centimeters of gravel where the groundwater was. Then underneath that, we had compacted clay that was natural. And that's what was perching that groundwater in all the gravel in the stream bed. So we dug this trench across the valley, and the trench was only like maybe 30, 40 meters long. And we cut through the gravel layer in the stream, and then we went keyed into this clay, and then we put the clay that we removed into the trench, and we compacted it using the bucket on the excavator, and we put in an underground speed bump. And what this did then is that as the water was traveling below the surface of the clay, it would hit this curtain or this groundwater dam of compacted clay, and then the water would rise to the surface and it filled our basins. So as we are working to build these groundwater dams, the excavations we made, the shallow depressions, were filling with groundwater, and this was right in the height of the summer when it was really dry. So we were actually making water in an arid landscape, and we restored 4 of these pools this way. And now we have water, and now Arizona Game and Fish will be looking at bringing in the northern leopard frog and restoring their populations in that area. Now, what also happened with this project is we had quite a bit of erosion. There's an erosional feature that we call a head cut. And a head cut is a lot like a waterfall, but the waterfall is in soil. And head cuts can be triggered by somebody moving a stream, by them straightening a stream. They can be triggered by somebody removing gravel from a valley, and they can even be triggered by horses and cows that form a trail up a stream bed. What we did is we controlled 6 of those head cuts using a technique that involves digging a trench and making a riffle out of rock. So now we don't have that erosion anymore, because if we had not controlled those head cuts, then that erosion would have filled the wetlands we restored with soil. So a landscape that's been damaged by, too many horses, too many cows, by somebody moving a stream, by somebody digging a ditch, these can be restored. These can be brought back. And oftentimes, though, this work requires the use of heavy equipment. Now, we did a lot of work out at the Dye Ranch by hand. We moved a lot of rock by hand. We had many volunteers out there. We had many people from Arizona Game and Fish, from an organization called ARC, Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And then we also had many people out there from Bat Conservation International. We all had one thing in common. We love the environment, and we recognize how important water is on an arid landscape, and we were willing to work hard to bring this water back. So the projects we worked on, I think they're going to last for many, many years without maintenance. A fence has been erected around the area to help manage livestock access. And I'm not against cows at all. Cows need to drink, but I think if we manage their access to water, we can have both wildlife habitat, plant habitat, and livestock habitat. And everybody's happy, including the ranchers, because they want to be viewed as people who are also concerned and want to help the environment. And we can do both with these practices.
Man, that's a fantastic story. I love that as a case study because it illustrates the importance of really understanding the history and the context of where you're working. Had you not understood how the land had shifted in past decades, it's easy to conclude, oh, well, there's just not water available anymore. Maybe we don't have to go that much deeper. But, there's a lot of ways of draining or kind of breaking the water cycle in an area beyond just the active drainage that has been done in so many other areas.
And let's look at the design process for many of these projects. Unfortunately, many of us have been taught that engineers are the ones that should design these water projects, and it should be done inside of an office in front of a computer using AutoCAD. Now, I have been designing wetlands and streams and building them for over 46 years. I have built over 3,000 wetlands, getting close to a couple hundred streams, and I have found that I have never been able to design one from being inside. I can't do it. I have to be on the ground looking for clues, looking for signs of drainage, looking for what's happening to the water on the landscape, and then I can work to prepare a set of design plans. But some of these projects, I spend days on the ground wandering and digging test holes and taking measurements of elevations using a laser and talking to other people. Even though I've been doing this for 46 years, I'm still convinced the projects turn out better if I'm out on the ground with several other people because we see things differently. But yet we can all agree that action is needed to bring water back to the landscape. So we try to figure out where is the precipitation going, where is the snowmelt going, and how can we hold that on our landscape for a little bit longer so it can help us with our planned uses. Whether that's using water to irrigate crops, whether that's using water to provide breeding habitat for rare dragonflies, oftentimes we want to hold that water on the property for a little bit longer before it starts its journey downhill. And this can be done. And there are several books that have been written about doing this. I have written 4 books about wetlands and wetland restoration, and I've started producing videos, and I've been placing these on YouTube as well as on my website. And these videos are set up to help people to be successful with wetland restoration and wetland creation, no matter where they live. And people will say to me, well, Tom, you develop these techniques in North America. How can they help us in other countries? Well, I respond by saying, what are the 3 main soil textures in the world? They are sand, they are silt, and they are clay. And wherever you go in the world, you will find sand, silt, or clay. And they can be in different mixtures. So that means if you learn how to build a wetland in eastern Kentucky, more than likely you can build a wetland in Spain using similar techniques because the soil textures are similar. And I've produced a video that will help you to identify soil texture. Now, I took a soil science course in college, and I have to say it was the most boring class I've ever taken. The professor gave us no application. But when it comes to wetland and stream restoration, it's all about soil texture. And you can use simple tests by taking a clump of soil in your hand about the size of a golf ball, adding a little bit of water, mixing that soil and the water together, and then seeing how long of a thin ribbon you can form with your fingers. And the longer the ribbon, the higher the clay content. The shorter the ribbon, the higher the sand content. And you can learn how you can rearrange the soil in place to meet your objectives. Again, whether it's for farming, for irrigation, for watering your animals, or for watching wildlife. And if you can figure out a way to rearrange the soil on your property, your project will cost a lot less compared to using some of the other techniques that are out there for building wetland areas.
Yeah, and so beyond the ribbon test for your soil texture, can you tell me about what are the indicators you look for on a site to tell you whether or not a wetland is feasible or possible? And on the flip side, which ones would tell you this is not an appropriate site for a wetland?
That's a really good question. What are the indicators? So when I'm walking on an area of land, whether it's a farm field or somebody's backyard or a forest area, what right away I look for sedges and rushes. And sedges are different than grass. Rushes are different than grass. Grass has joints or nodes that go all the way to the ground. Sedges have sharp edges and they're bright green and they stay green all winter. Now, rushes are round. They don't have these joints or nodes. So there's a little saying that I remember. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have nodes that go to the ground. And if you can learn to identify sedges and rushes, then you'll know that there's groundwater present on a site. And you'll know that you could restore a wetland or build a wetland on the site because the ground is saturated.
Yeah.
And I see this throughout the arid Southwest in the US. And I have even seen this in Taiwan and New Zealand, that if you see sedges and rushes, the ground is saturated. And more than likely, when you see sedges and rushes, you'll find deep footprints from horses, from cows, and your feet may be getting wet. The ground is sloppy. If you see sedges and rushes, you probably don't want to drive through the area because you might get stuck in your vehicle. So if you see sedges and rushes, you have a good spot where it may already be a wetland, and you'll have to make the decision, is the wetland that's here what I want to keep and manage, or do I want to change the type of wetland to another to help provide habitat, like for rare species? And in many areas, in order to go into an area with sedges and rushes, you may need a permit or approval from the government. And make sure you get these permits and approvals before you do your project. And another thing to make sure of is make sure you look for buried utilities, because you never know if there's gas pipes buried in the ground or electric cables. I don't want your first wetland project to be your last.
Yeah.
You never know where these things are buried. And wherever you live, you could always call, and it's a free service where they come out and mark any buried utility.
Yeah.
And let you know so that you're not surprised. Really important. But other indicators of knowing if we could build a wetland or a pond or even a lake, look for ditches. If you see a ditch, somebody has worked to eliminate standing water and to lower the elevation of groundwater. And if you see a ditch, you can build a wetland or a pond or a lake. However, if you see a ditch like that, you want to make sure that your project doesn't flood the neighbors. Your neighbors probably wouldn't appreciate a lake on their property. Now, maybe they would, but most of the time they wouldn't. And that could get you into legal trouble. And that's where the engineering comes in, using something called a laser level. And I have a video posted on that. If you want to learn how to use a laser to take elevations, you can actually look at, if I were to fill this ditch in, would I flood my neighbors? If I were to sever this buried drainage structure, am I going to flood my neighbors? And if the answer is yes, you better talk to your neighbors and work something out and redesign your project, because not every ditch can be filled, because few people own enough land to do a project without affecting their neighbors. And it is important to have kind neighbors that you get along with, no matter where you live. And giving them a wetland that they don't want, that's not good. Now, you brought up mosquitoes. And
Let's go back to mosquitoes. Some of the cautionary reasons why people might be disincentivized or think that putting in a wetland is going to bring problems. Let's go for there.
Many people assume that if you restore a wetland, that you're going to bring in hordes of mosquitoes. They are wrong. There's more to it than that. What I have learned, and others have learned, is that a healthy wetland reduces mosquito numbers. And don't turn off the program. This is really true.
Yeah,
A
justify
healthy
that, Tom. Come
wetland
on.
will reduce mosquito numbers. And how do we know this? Because in a wetland, you're going to find all sorts of mosquito predators. If you take a dip net and sample the waters of a wetland, you're probably going to find dragonfly larvae, damselfly larvae, salamander larvae. You're going to find the larvae of toads and frogs. You may find the larvae of water boatmen, water striders, diving beetles, and many, many. In fact, every one of these will eat mosquito larvae. And so when you have a wetland that has all these mosquito predators in it, yes, a mosquito is enticed to lay its eggs in the water of that wetland. But once it does, the eggs are eaten by all these mosquito predators. It's a race to eat these eggs. And if a few of the eggs hatch and you have wigglers, which are the little mosquito larvae, they're going to be eaten by other mosquitoes. I'm sorry, they're not being eaten by other mosquitoes. They're going to be eaten by these mosquito predators. And what we have found is that salamander larvae and dragonfly larvae, they are going to control the mosquitoes. And then during the day, you have all these swallows and purple martins flying around your wetland. They're eating the adult mosquitoes that are trying to lay their eggs in the wetland. And at night, we have the bat species. The bats will control those adult mosquitoes. So when you take a look at a healthy wetland, what we say about it is mosquitoes may check in, but they won't check out. And I've gone to schools and I've built wetlands for science education. And when we're designing the wetland project, looking at how we can block that ditch, how we can restore the wetland basin, what happens is that we're being bit by mosquitoes. And the principal will say, I don't know about this wetland. I don't want more mosquitoes. And I say to them, okay, once the wetland's built, I want your students to monitor the water for all the different aquatic life. And what they find in every case is that the mosquito predators move in and they control the mosquitoes, and they have fewer mosquitoes than before. So where do the mosquitoes breed? Well, if you leave a coffee cup outside and it fills with water, that's an unhealthy wetland. Mosquitoes will breed in it. If you have a gutter on your home that does not drain, that's an unhealthy wetland. Mosquitoes will breed in it. How about a 5-gallon bucket behind your back door? How about a tire, an old tire that holds a little bit of water? How about a ditch? A ditch is not a healthy wetland. So people have drained many wetlands to get rid of mosquitoes, and they've drained them by digging ditches. They've actually made the problem worse because they've made an unhealthy wetland in the ditch that now only breeds mosquitoes. So this is really important to know, because whenever we hear in the news that there's a new disease that's being carried by mosquitoes, then many city officials are saying, we need to fill in all these wetlands. Well, I'll tell you what, there aren't many wetlands left for them to fill in. And what I've found in most communities all around the world, the majority of the wetlands have been drained and filled in. And unfortunately, because of this worry about mosquitoes. So we have a lot of work to do to bring these wetlands back. And why do we want to bring them back? They're beautiful to look at. Wetlands have the most unique patterns of vegetation and water, and they're unbelievably productive to plants and animals because many wetlands are in full sunlight and you have shallow water. So when you think about planting a garden, you don't make your garden in the shade. You make your garden in the sun. Many wetlands are in sunlight and they have shallow water. No wonder they're so productive. And that's why we see so much life in them and so many of these rare species of plants and animals. Just exciting places to visit. And I've worked with many people who have built wetlands on their property without government help. They said, you know what, we're not going to take a vacation this year. We're going to build a small wetland, maybe in our backyard, maybe on the 1 acre we own, or maybe we're going to work with an agency to restore a wetland. And then they adopt these wetlands and they monitor what moves in. And everybody is so surprised at all the animals that come into wetland areas. You really don't have to move them in. They're going to find the wetlands on their own. I don't know if they can smell the water. I know they can see the water, but I have built wetlands on tops of mountains. And within a year, we have frogs, toads, and salamanders breeding in those wetlands. How do they find the wetland? So I'm going to describe a project that we recently completed in California. And this project was on the Tahoe National Forest, and it's near a community called Michigan Bluff. And this is where gold mining took place in the 1800s. There's a small frog there called the California red-legged frog, and it's faced with extinction in the US. It's a threatened species. And what it does is it will breed in shallow water wetlands that do not contain fish. And these wetlands do not contain the American bullfrog, which is a non-native species in California. And so there are very few shallow water wetlands on the Tahoe National Forest. Most of them were destroyed by the gold mining activity in the 1800s, and many of them were destroyed by the creation of farmland in the valleys. So now the valleys are occupied by people. They're not part of a national forest. The ridgetops are mountains and they're rocky. Well, what we've been doing on the Tahoe National Forest for the California red-legged frog is that we've been building wetland areas on the mountaintops. And we've been using a variety of techniques. One of the techniques includes using an aquatic safe liner, a liner that is made out of plastic and is quite thick, like 30 mil.
We're talking about like EPDM liners, right? Those rubber sheets.
They can be EPDM, which is a synthetic rubber. They can be PVC. They can be RPE. But it's critical that they be certified aquatic safe, which means there's no chemicals added and they'd be safe for drinking water.
Do you have a preferred one of those?
Pardon?
Do you have a preferred one of those options?
Actually, all three work quite well.
Yeah.
And there's
have you ever worked with the bentonite clay impregnated liners?
Bentonite? You said bentonite?
I know how you feel about bentonite, but I'm talking about the liner product that has clay in it.
Yes, that's like swearing at me. Bentonite does not work. I remember when I started building wetlands, and way back in the 70s, some of these didn't hold water, and everybody said, use bentonite or use a bentonite liner. So we started mixing bentonite in the ground. We never had a success. Over the years, I've worked with hundreds of people who say bentonite works, and they've never been able to show me a success. Bentonite rock that is ground up. It has clay-like properties, but it is not clay. Bentonite is actually sandy loam. You're not able to compact it. And when bentonite dries, it cracks and it leaks. I have worked with landowners that have spent $30,000 spreading bentonite in failed ponds, made no difference. I work with one landowner that built a 1-acre pond in Arizona. It wasn't holding water. He spent $30,000 adding bentonite, and he still had to add the same amount of water each day. We went in there and we installed an aquatic safe liner. We buried it deep in the ground, and now he only has to add water a couple of times a year.
But so this is exactly why I think I'm increasingly interested in them, is not because they're perfectly impermeable the way some people think, but because they can actually slowly recharge the water underneath. And in that way, it could be useful depending on the objective you have, right?
Well, bentonite liners are very expensive to purchase.
They are.
But what bothers me the most about bentonite liners and bentonite, it's not aquatic safe.
Okay.
The material is not labeled for aquatic organisms. So what happens when you use bentonite, the water becomes cloudy and remains turbid, and it kills your invertebrates and your vertebrates, and you end up with an unhealthy wetland that only breeds mosquitoes. So there are much easier materials to work with, EPDM, RPE, PVC, that are aquatic safe. You buy these liners that are factory seamed, you protect them on both sides with thick geotextile, and you bury them in the ground with at least 8 inches of soil on top. We're looking at 20 centimeters of soil on top of them. You don't put heavy equipment on the liner, any type of liner. They're not made strong enough. You'll end up shearing it, and it won't hold water.
Yeah.
Now, as far as getting a controlled release of water into the ground, then I recommend making an overflow or a spillway that's permeable so that when your liner constructed wetland fills or pond, the overflow will inject water into the ground slowly. And that's a good way of recharging. So, like if you have a stormwater basin that's quite large and it only holds water for a day or two after a rain, you may want to put a small liner supplied wetland in the very bottom of it. Then that will provide all the habitat for plants and animals. And then when you have a severe storm, then you have all that permeability above the edge of the top of the liner. That works out really well.
Man, I'm so
But
glad
I
I
try
asked you about this. Nobody's been able to give me that quality of answer as to the advantages and disadvantages of using these different products. That was super useful. I'm actually looking at a project for a client right now where we're weighing out those different options, and I think you just helped me made my choice.
Well, I can help you with identifying what products to use and where to use them. I was working on Puerto Rico, and we were working to provide breeding habitat for the great crested toad.
Hmm.
And what's happening is sea levels are rising, and all these ephemeral wetlands or vernal ponds are becoming inundated by the ocean and turning saline. Well, we were looking at their mountaintops to help the crested toad, and all we could find was rocky ground and gravelly ground and sandy ground. So we decided to use liners to help them
Hmm.
build buildings. And the thing is about using an aquatic safe liner, it is much less costly than hauling in clay. Many people say, I don't like liners. Well, I don't like liners either. But if you try to haul in clay soil, your costs can be 100 times higher.
Yeah.
Because first of all, you have to dig a basin and remove that soil, and then you have to find clay. And all these contractors will tell you, I've got clay, I've got a big pile of clay out in the backyard. And you go do the ribbon test and you find out it's not clay, it's silt loam.
Yeah.
Well, silt loam is different than clay.
That's not going to hold
So they'll
water.
start hauling in this soil and it's not clay. And then also they'll haul it in and it won't be the right moisture content. And you're not able to compact clay unless it's suitable moisture content. And so what happens then is you have to bring in an excavator, a dump truck, and a water truck, and you have to try to mix that clay. And then you need to put it in thin layers and compact each 15-centimeter layer with like a vibratory roller. And I tell you what, it dries out quickly, especially like in Spain. And if
Yeah.
it dries out, you're not compacting it.
Yeah.
So you just don't line it with clay. So if you want to build a wetland using clay, you want to have a minimum of 70 to 80 centimeters of clay that's compacted in the basin, compacted in layers under the right moisture content. So I've worked wetland projects where if we use a aquatic safe liner, I can build that wetland for $10,000 US. But if we haul in clay, it will be over $100,000
Wow.
US and take a lot longer to build. So
Yep.
the liners give you a way to build a wetland anywhere on the landscape. You may wonder, how long will one of these aquatic safe liners last? And I ask people, would you be happy if it lasted 2 years? Oh, no, never. How about 5 years? No, never. 10 years? Yeah, maybe a couple people would be happy with 10 years. But realistically, we want that wetland to last our lifetimes.
If not more.
And I'm convinced that we now have the techniques to build wetlands that will last thousands of years. It's entirely possible. We can use a liner to build a wetland that should last for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah.
When I'm working on a wetland restoration project and I dig these deep core trenches for groundwater dams, I can find leaves and I can find logs that have been buried for over 10,000 years. And if we take a liner that is made out of petroleum products and we protect it on both sides with geotextile and we bury it deep in the ground, that liner should last forever.
Yeah.
Now, I produced a video and it's titled How to Build a Wetland That Will Last Forever. And it's based on what we found at the Fort Ancient Earthworks. This is in Oregonia, Ohio. and it's high above the Miami River. It's on a high hill above the Miami River. And what happened was 2,000 years ago, indigenous peoples built a series of ponds or wetlands 2,000 years ago, and they're still holding water today. And what they also did is they built this earthworks or this ridge. And this ridge was like 23 feet high in places, 3.5 miles long. It's an amazing video to watch to see what people did 2,000 years ago. But they purposely constructed these shallow water ponds, and they compacted the clay in them in layers. And they have a very small watershed or catchment, and they don't have a stream coming into them or flowing out of them. But 2,000 years later, they're still holding water, and they're full of all these different animals that eat mosquito larvae. And it's pretty amazing that if people can build a wetland that will last over 2,000 years, we can do the same with our current technology. So when you look at building a wetland, it is possible the wetland you're building is going to last for over 1,000 years. That's a pretty good investment, folks.
That's a very good investment. Yes.
Really
Especially if you're looking at return for healthy ecological function and biodiversity, there's little else that you could do that'll give you this type of result.
I agree. I've worked as a wildlife biologist now for over 56 years, and I am convinced the number one thing we can do to help wildlife is to restore a wetland area or to build a wetland area. I'm really not going to differentiate between the two. Most people say to me, hey, wetland restoration is better than wetland creation. I'll say, how do you know it's not a restoration? Well, you can tell there was never a wetland there. I'll say, well, look over there, 50 meters, there's a ditch. This is really a restoration.
Yeah.
So most wetland creation projects are really wetland restoration projects, but somebody's done a really good job draining the wetland.
Yeah.
And you have a hard time telling it used to be a wetland. And in Europe, people were draining wetlands over 1,000 years ago, and the areas don't look like wetlands anymore.
It's true.
But once you start digging, you'll find the signs of these wetland areas, which is pretty amazing.
Absolutely. So look, Tom, with all of these descriptions and these stories, I want to try and lay this out in a process and somewhat of an investigation process that people can follow themselves. In my own work in ecosystem restoration, I've kind of got this down to a triage when I look at a site, and it goes from, first of all, identifying and stopping the damage, because oftentimes people run right into restoring or building something without actually removing the problem in the first place. From there, we go into how we can protect those aspects of the ecosystem which are still there and functioning, and then how we can restore the parts that have been damaged, and then only the last side being building something new that there's no precedent for before the installation that we're doing. When you go into a site and look at this, let's go through this process. What are the things that you're looking first for? I think you've mentioned the different indications of drainage that you identified to show that there used to be a wetland there. How do you work through that process in order to figure out what sort of installation or actions are appropriate for that project?
Well, if a landowner is interested in a wetland or a pond or a lake that will last forever, don't choose a site where all that damage is taking place. And if there's a deep ditch and the ditch is eroding, if you see head cuts in the drainage, stay away from it. That's an expensive project. And people say to me, hey, if I build a wetland here, I can control erosion. Hey, if you build a wetland in a ditch or a stream where erosion is taking place, your wetland is going to fill up with soil in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so if you want to build a wetland that will last forever at a low cost, then find a level area of ground. Find an area of ground with a slope less than 6%. Even better, a slope less than 2%. Set up a laser and take elevations. And you want to make sure that you have no more than like a 30 or a 60 centimeter change in elevation from upper to lower edge. You want to make sure that that ground is fairly flat. The steeper the ground, the smaller the wetland, the higher the cost. The flatter the ground, the less expensive the wetland, and the larger the wetland. So flat ground is the place to go.
And
The
less
next thing
likely to
you
fill
want to
up
do,
with sediment from erosion.
so if you pick a spot that's in a ditch, more than likely there's erosion in that ditch, and you're going to have to take some expensive actions to stop that erosion. Now, people say, well, I need that water to fill my wetland. No, you don't. Most anywhere in the world, it rains enough to fill up a wetland as long as the water's not rapidly soaking into the ground. So after you find this level area of ground, and it can be any size, wetlands don't have to be huge. I have seen wetlands built the same size as an office desk, and they're functioning ecosystems. At the same time, I've built wetlands that are over 1,000 hectares in size. They can be any size. But once you find this level area of ground, dig a test hole in the middle of it. And you can use a shovel to dig it. You can use an auger and dig it as deep as your body will allow you to dig. And it may take you 2 or 3 hours to dig this test hole. And you want to find out what is underneath the ground. Now, if you're digging a deep hole, of course, you're going to call about buried utilities so you don't knock out electric or gas service. But when you're digging this hole, you are looking for changes in color and texture, and you're sampling that soil using your hands with water adding to the soil, and you're finding out, is there enough clay where I can reshape this soil to make a basin that will hold water? Or am I finding gravel and the gravel's dry? Or have I found bedrock within a meter of the surface? What am I finding with this test hole? And it's really important to look at these different layers, because if you find that you have clay soil on the surface, but beneath the clay is gravel and the gravel is dry, you're going to have a tough time building a wetland there. Think of a hole in the bottom of a flower pot. Every flower pot has a hole in it to take care of excess drainage. So if you are trying to build a wetland on a site where there's clay near the surface, and then there's that gravel in the bottom, that's like a big hole in your flower pot, and that's going to drain your wetland. You need to figure out a way to plug that hole in the bottom. And how we often do that is with clay textured soil, or we use one of these aquatic safe liners. Now, if you're digging that test hole and there are sedges and rushes, and you're digging that test hole, water will probably start coming into your test hole. And then what that shows us, all we have to do is to make a larger hole and shape it to look like a natural depression. And as long as we do not compact the bottom, it will fill with groundwater. So the example I give to people is that if I give you 2 buckets, one bucket is empty, the other bucket is filled with soil. Now we take a garden hose and we saturate the bucket that is filled with soil. We fill the bucket that's empty. Which bucket will contain more water? The bucket that was empty and we filled with water, or the bucket that was filled with soil that we saturated?
Well, the logical
Well, of course,
answer would obviously be the empty one, right?
yeah, the empty bucket does. So when you find an area with sedges and rushes and you dig a test hole and water comes into that test hole, that tells you you can build a larger depression and it will fill with water, and it will contain more water than the soil that was saturated did. And this is what we're doing in response to climate change in the arid regions. We are finding areas where the ground is saturated, and we are removing the soil and shaping natural wetland basins, and they are filling with groundwater, and they will hold water year round compared to the wetlands that have the clay-lined basin. Because those wetlands, the water will evaporate much faster and won't be replenished by groundwater. And yes, it's good to have a wetland that is supplied with both groundwater and with surface water. But when designing a wetland project, you have a decision to make. How is my wetland going to hold water? It will be primarily groundwater, where it will feel like a giant well, or will it be surface water where I'm dependent on rainfall and worried about evaporation? Now, there are people who teach classes on wetland design that have you do all these calculations looking at watershed size and runoff coefficients. I haven't found that technique to work in building wetlands. These people are really smart when it comes to mathematics, but they haven't built many wetlands. The real key to building a pond or a wetland is to get it to hold the water that comes into it naturally, to slow it from soaking into the ground. Now, if you are building a rain garden, you want that water to soak into the ground fairly rapidly. But if you are building a wetland that will provide breeding habitat for waterfowl and for frogs, you want it to hold water long enough so that their eggs can develop and hatch. And that's why you have to look at your objectives. So you ask me about where would I find a place to build a wetland? I would find this flat piece of ground that doesn't change much more than 60 centimeters from upper to lower edge. I would dig my test hole and try to find clay. And if I can find clay, I can reshape that clay into a basin at a very low cost. If I can't find clay, can I dig deep enough to find groundwater? I've built many wetlands where I have to dig down 2 or 3 meters to expose groundwater in arid regions. But that gets more expensive. It is not cheap to build a wetland area. But an example I give is, okay, think of the community where you live. What would be the cost of purchasing a 3-bedroom house with a garage? What would be that cost? In the United States, that cost is crazy high.
Yeah.
We generally build a wetland for less than 10% of the cost of building or purchasing a home. It's still a lot of money, but that wetland you build can last for over 1,000 years. So now when I build a wetland, people will say, will you guarantee this wetland? I'll say, yeah, I'll guarantee it. For how long? I'll say 1,000 years, I guarantee it. Then they look at me and they smile. And I said, I am so sure this wetland will last that if you're not happy with it, I'll come back and repair it at no charge. This is because we picked the best technique.
Yeah.
The 3 main techniques for building wetlands. Number 1, find clay texture soil. Reshape it and compact that clay in layers. Number 2, find a site where groundwater is near the surface. Excavate and loosen the soil so groundwater fills your basin. And number 3, if there's no clay and no groundwater, use an aquatic safe liner that is labeled as fish grade, aquatic safe, and protect that liner and bury it in the ground. And then you can have a water body that will last for many, many years. Yeah. And if you're interested in learning how to do this, stay tuned to my videos, which are offered at no charge. I have so many more that I'm working to produce.
I'm so excited. I'm one of those people who never hits the notifications on YouTube because I don't want to hear all the new stuff. Yours is the only one that I have. I'm waiting patiently for the next editions to come out.
Well, thank you. I have 6 that I'm working on, but I'm so busy now building wetlands that, producing a video, as you know, it takes time and lots of editing. And I'm being helped by Larry Dixon, a friend of mine who is also a professional photographer.
Nice.
And he's available. He says, Tom, when are we doing the next video? So we're going to have videos. I'm going to have videos posted on how to build wetlands using the groundwater technique, the surface water technique, using aquatic safe liners. There's going to be videos on how to control head cuts. You see, I was ready to write another book. I've written 4 books about wetlands. And what I find out is that people aren't reading my books. It's unfortunate. And younger people especially, they're not reading. They're going to watch the videos. So my daughter said, Dad, don't produce another book. She said, start recording videos. Well, I don't like being in front of a camera. And I don't think I've ever met anyone that likes being in front of a camera. If they like being in front of a camera, they're too vain. You wouldn't want to be with them. But Larry makes it easy for me. He's patient. And we're producing these videos. It really will keep your attention. We're trying to keep them so they're like 10, 15 minutes long at the most. And my hope is by this time next year, there will be enough videos posted where if you want to build a wetland on your property, or if you manage an area of land, that you can watch these videos and be more successful. And most people don't want you on a job site because there's things that go wrong. You know what? All you have to do is watch these TV shows on home repair and home remodeling, and everything goes wrong. That's what happens with wetland work. Once you start digging, you see things you don't expect.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important when you are building a pond or a wetland that you're on site.
Yes.
You can have the best set of engineering plans in the world, but once you start digging, you better be ready to change your plans because you can't see underground. And if you start encountering these buried drainage structures, you have to remove them, compact clay into place. If you find a permeable layer of gravel, if you find that bedrock is 5 meters below the surface instead of 3, you have to be ready to change. You would never build a house and not visit the site under construction. If anyone ever builds a house, you're going to be out there during construction, reviewing, commenting, and helping. Why would you ever build a wetland and turn it over to somebody else to build? Contractors generally don't know how to build wetlands. You must learn everything you can about it. And if you're listening to this podcast, it shows me that you're inquisitive and you're willing to put the time in learning how to do this. And that's what it takes. And think of a problem with your computer. It takes time to fix it, plus all this investigating. Building a wetland, most of us don't have experience working the soil the way people did 100 years ago. So we have a lot to learn about farming, about drainage, and about taking care of erosion problems, the destruction on the land, non-native invasive species, getting the government permits, teaching the government people of what you're doing is going to be good for the environment. Because most of the government people that review these applications, these permit applications, they're used to developers that are trying to make subdivisions and shopping centers. And if you come in with a wetland restoration project, they're going to be surprised and they're probably not going to trust you. So you have to earn their trust, teach them about drainage, and show them that what you're doing will be good for the environment.
Wasn't that funny that you have to earn the trust of the regulators when they're passing by all these shopping center and development block permits all the time, and one person who wants to do something positive, you have the uphill battle to try and get it done?
You know what? It really saddens me because I work with many agencies across the United States and Canada, and there are some regulations that were set up to protect wetlands. Unfortunately, the way these regulations have been interpreted, the regulations are protecting drained wetlands, like ditches. And I work with many of these government regulators. They're wonderfully dedicated individuals, but they're placing as much value on the ditch and the drained wetland, and they're missing the point. And that reminds me of a story. Many, many years ago, let's just say in the late 1800s, there was this child who wanted to see an elephant, wanted to go to the circus to see an elephant. So kept begging the parents, I want to see an elephant, want to see an elephant. Well, a couple months passed and the Barnum and Bailey Circus came into the small town. And the father said, son, we're going to see an elephant. So they take their horses and their buggy and they go into town and they're walking across the road to go to the big tent to see the elephants. And in the middle of the road, there's this huge pile of steamy stuff. And the boy looks at it and says, Daddy, look at the elephant. And the daddy smiles and said, oh, son, wait till you see the real thing. So the regulators that are placing value on the ditch, that's the elephant manure. They're missing the elephant, which was the wetland. So the key is to get outside to learn about how many of our wetlands have been drained and filled, and look what can be done with restoration. Unfortunately, in the US and Canada, the majority of the wetlands that are being built for compensatory mitigation.
Hmm.
Somebody's building those wetlands because they have to, because they destroyed another wetland. Now, we as private individuals, we can reverse this downward trend in wetland loss, and we can build wetlands on our own property without the government help. And we can turn this around. We can help agencies to see that it is a good thing to restore wetlands, not because we have to, but because we want to. And we can provide habitat for all these rare species of plants and animals. We can build wetlands that don't require maintenance, and we can build wetlands that don't cost a lot. Do you need an engineering plan to build a wetland? No. Do you have to have a PhD in wetland ecology? No. You just have to have an interest. And I work with many folks. I work with people who work for school districts as accountants. I work with folks who are masons and contractors. I work with others who are landscape businesses. I work with still other people that are plumbers, but yet they want to help the environment and they can build these wetlands. And now there's more and more information out there on the web. There's podcasts like this one where you can learn these techniques. And I think I've talked to people that are in their 70s who have built their first wetland, and they say it's one of the most rewarding things they've done with their life is to bring back wetland area. And they're just thrilled with everything they see using it.
Yeah, I can absolutely vouch for that. I haven't built wetlands the way you've described them so far, but putting in ponds and putting in
Yes.
water retention features is pretty close. And my goodness, the excitement when those things start to fill up, when life comes back to a space where it's been devoid up until that point. I can't wait to get started on these as well. Now, there's two more questions that I'd really like to dive into. One, I would really be remiss because a big focus of this show is going beyond the initial excitement of installing a new feature or restoring an aspect of the ecology into the maintenance that's required to make sure that it succeeds over the long run. And I know that you just mentioned that if you install it correctly, if you follow the right steps and do a good quality job, these can last hundreds of thousands of years. At the same time, there are impacts and problems that can come up. Can you tell me about some of those that could get in the way or interrupt the longevity of one of these installations?
Yes, maintenance is critical to success. Things happen that you don't anticipate, especially with the early projects. The first thing is to look at the wetland or the pond you built after the first heavy rain. In fact, get out there during the first heavy rain, and you're going to find out if there's erosion. Maybe where the water comes into your wetland, maybe the slope is too steep, and maybe you have rivulets or rills forming. You need to take care of those quick before they turn into gullies. So look at how water is coming into your wetland and look at how water is leaving your wetland. These are critical places to look at for maintenance. And I work with many agencies and they say, oh, we need to be looking at plant colonization, non-native plants. And I said, no, you need to be looking at erosion. Is the water coming in causing erosion? Is the water coming out causing erosion? And if it is, you have a shovel and a rake with you and you take care of it that day.
Yeah.
They say, oh, we're going to prepare this report and we're going to take action, maybe a year later. So I was just at Yosemite National Park in California designing wetland projects to provide habitat for rare species of wildlife. And there was a restoration project going on, and it was of a ditch and a stream and a wet meadow. And oh, did I see erosion. I saw head cuts that were forming. Oh, it was really frightening. And I
Yeah.
said, you need to get a crew out here this week and take care of this. You can take care of this. And they said, no, we're not allowed to come back until October. Oh, my word. That could be
It's going to be
devastating.
so much more
So,
expensive then.
number one concern is maintenance, and you may have to use rock. You
Yeah.
may have to dig deep into your jeans and pull out those greens and buy some rock and put rock and armor that spillway so it doesn't erode. So yes, erosion. Okay, another thing that happens, it can happen quickly, is non-native plants. When you build that wetland area, you're going to have this exposed soil, And if a plant is coming in, catch it early. Like in many areas, we have what we call narrow leaf cattail, a non-native plant. And people will see a couple of narrow leaf cattail plants in the water. They go, oh, is that nice? There's cattails. Hey, wait a minute, folks. It's non-native. You need to walk out into the water and pull it. Oh, we like these cattails. Well, next year they'll be so thick, you won't be able to control them.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to non-native invasive species, when you see them on your job site, stop what you're doing, remove them. Don't write up a report that nobody reads and comes back a year later. It's going to be too late. Take care of it immediately. Those are really big things that I look at. And then let's say it's not holding water. Let's say you get a 5 centimeter rain and you go out there and your wetland's not holding any water. That is a danger sign. Maybe change objectives and call it a rain garden. I don't know. But if it's not holding water right away, then you know that you need to rebuild it. You didn't pick the right technique, or it wasn't put in correctly. Drainage systems are designed to remove standing water within 3 days during the growing season. So if you built a wetland and you haven't disabled that subsurface drainage system and it goes dry within 3 days, guess what? The drainage system is still working. And I've worked with many people with government agencies, especially the Natural Resources Conservation Service in the US, and they say, we don't have the money, and we're not going to give the farmer the money to look for these buried drainage systems and disable them. My response is then don't build a wetland. Somebody's been there before you. And what they'll do is that they will help the farmer to finance these wetland projects. They won't disable the ditches. They won't disable the subsurface drainage systems. And then the wetland doesn't hold water. And the farmer's out all this money. The government's out all this money. And who's going to come back and try to fix it? You know, if you bring your car in for service and that mechanic doesn't fix it the first time, you're a little reluctant to bring it back to that mechanic again and pay more money.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with wetlands. If it doesn't hold water the first time, your trust level's gone.
Yeah.
So these are the things that I really look at for maintenance is erosion and whether or not it's holding water as planned, and are any non-native plants coming in that you don't want, and you can control them right away. And no matter how much heavy equipment you use, this is going to require hand labor. Yeah. I have yet to find a way to build and to maintain a wetland that doesn't require some sweat equity. You just
AI is not going to replace the wetland maintenance and installation process anytime soon.
Exactly. People are still needed out there.
That's good news. That's good news. Now, one thing that we glossed over real quick at the beginning is that wetlands are not one thing, right? There's wet pasture lands or meadows. There are forested. I mean, maybe we should start there and describe some of the many different types of wetlands, and then we can talk about how you might set your own wetland on a trajectory towards one or another.
Okay. When I work with a landowner, I'll say, what would you like to see in your wetland? And they usually think about it. Well, I want a wetland. I go, well, what would you like to see? Would you like to see cypress trees? Would you like to see, swamp white oaks? Do you want to see wood ducks? Do you want to see mallards? How about frogs? Do your grandchildren like to catch frogs? Or why do you want the water? Do you want it to irrigate your crops?
Sure.
Want the water for a golf course? What do you want the water for? And it gets them thinking about it. And I say, okay, I want to write this down. Tell me the main reasons that you want a wetland. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to look at the landscape scale. Tell me what you'd like to see here. And what most people will say to me is, I'd like to see ducks and I'd like to see frogs. I go, okay. Then that tells me what type of wetland you might want. Now, here are some of the different types of wetlands. The wetlands that people are most familiar with, we call them a shallow marsh or an emergent wetland. And these have shallow water most of the year. And they can have cattails growing around the edge. They can have sedges and rushes around the edge. And this is where you see a lot of wildlife. This is where you see herons and egrets and ducks and ducklings. And they're probably the most beautiful wetland out there. People like emergent wetlands. Well, then there's another type of wetland we call a vernal pond or an ephemeral wetland. And these are wetlands that contain shallow water in the spring. And by late summer and early fall, they go dry. But those are the wetlands that provide habitat for the rare species of frogs, toads, salamanders, and invertebrates like fairy shrimp. But these are the wetlands that very few people are building because they only hold water when it's wet outside. But then there's another wetland that we call the wet meadow or the wet prairie. And maybe you've seen these. They have a lot of sedges and rushes and many beautiful wildflowers in them, but the soil is moist. If you were to try to drive across a wet meadow, you would probably get stuck and your tire tracks would fill with water. Very few people are building wet meadows, but they're of critical importance to our pollinators. We have to have wet meadows out there, and that's where the frogs and the toads will grow up. Another type of wetland is called a forested wetland or a swamp. And this is where you'll see shallow pools of water, but you'll also see trees. And these trees are buttressed, they're wide at the base, and they're adapted towards living in saturated soil. And trees that grow in them are everything from bald cypress to the tupelo to like pin oak and swamp white oak, things like
Cedars in the Pacific Northwest are my reference.
Yes, yeah. Western red cedar.
Love those.
Trees like that. Okay, now those are fascinating. Not many people want forested wetlands.
Yeah.
Not many people. They call them swamps, but many birds will nest in them, and you'll find deer hiding in them. They're really great for rain gardens. I mean, if you have trees, they pull a lot of water out of the ground.
Yeah.
Of course, we have the shade.
Yeah.
But then the wetland that few people like is called the shrub swamp.
Yeah.
And these are areas that are dominated by alder, by willow, by maybe buttonbush. They're really dense and hard to walk through, but they're really important to moose and they're really important to songbirds, to birds for nesting.
Sure.
But I've only built a handful of shrub swamps because most of the people I work with, they're not interested. But there's a little bird that is in the United States called the American woodcock. It has to have shrub swamps. And that's where it eats and where it nests. So I like shrub swamps because if a beaver is in an area, the beaver will dam the stream and it will flood the shrub swamp and then it will eat everything that's flooded. And shrub swamps are really important to beaver. I mean, they're really important. Then, of course, if you have beaver coming in and they dam the stream, then you're going to have the emergent wetland that's used by the waterfowl and all the amphibians and reptiles. So that's pretty good. So what I do is that I'll show people photographs of wetlands and say, what do you think of this? And usually say, oh, I really like that. Or no, I don't like that. Then I'll, talk to them about wildlife. And then as the day goes on, they'll give me more information. I really would like my grandchildren to catch fish. Oh, if you want your grandchildren to catch fish in the wetland, then it needs to be deep enough and it needs to contain water all year.
Yeah.
And we need to make points and peninsulas so they can access it. So really be clear on your objectives. One wetland cannot do everything. People say, I want a wetland that provides habitat for rare species, controls flooding, recharges groundwater, and looks beautiful and will last forever. I'm sorry, I can't do that. I don't have pixie dust. But I can help you meet your objectives. So in many projects, we build multiple ponds and multiple wetlands. We'll build one for fish, one for frogs, one for a forested environment. We'll build many wetlands. Is it possible to build too many wetlands? No, it's not. It's not possible.
That is exactly the answer I would expect from you, Tom. I just love the image that you put in my head of imagine in the future when, people are used to having, let's say, a carpet or a tile salesman come with their book with pictures of the different patterns and colors. But instead, they've got Tom coming by with pictures of different types of wetland installations that they could have. That's a world I want to live in.
There you go. Well, you lived in Minnesota. I lived in Minnesota. There were wetlands all over the place.
Indeed.
And that's been my goal is wherever I live to try to make it look more like Minnesota.
Well,
How's
it's so
that?
important to have that reference in your mind, right? If you
Yeah.
haven't lived around something like that, it's hard to explain the beauty and the abundance of having so much water in the landscape and the wildlife that that attracts and the humidity in the air that keeps things moist and growing even during dry spells. It's really important to have that in your reference to even know what's possible.
I agree. I agree. This can be done.
All right, so Tom, let's get to this last question before we wrap up here. And you had mentioned before that you could make a wetland as small as a desktop. And for so many people who do not have access to larger tracts of land and still like this idea, how would you recommend they get started? Because we talked about all the different processes, the indicators and such. And in any case, when someone is first starting, we always recommend that you try small and manageable, maybe hand-built scale installations. And it seems like that's where a lot of potential is for people who, A, don't want to go through all the permitting process and don't have the resources necessarily to bring in either big equipment or expensive materials. Give us a playbook on how to start small wetland projects.
All right. Yes, you can build a wetland in your backyard or your front yard. It's going to require a bit of work by hand, and more than likely you will need a aquatic safe liner
Mhm.
because when you look at where a home has been built, all that soil has been mixed and
Yes.
disturbed. And there are, different layers that have been mixed horizontally as well as vertically. So you'll want to find an area of your yard. I recommend going towards the backyard and maybe up against a fence or maybe up against the wooded edge, not right in the middle. And what you want to do is a soil test. Take a shovel and dig that hole. But before you do that, make sure your bare utilities are marked. I can tell you story after story where people have not called before they've dug, even in a backyard, and they hit a main electric cable. It's not a good thing. So call before you dig, even in your backyard. Dig that test hole and find out, do you have layers? Do you have good clay? If you have high clay soil, you may be able to build without a liner, but you have to figure out a way to compact that soil, and you may have to rent what's called a thumper. You see them using these to compact areas like on sidewalks. You may have to rent one of these thumpers to compact that soil in layers because it's really tough to compact. Years ago, they used to lead horses and mules across the soil to compact it in layers. Not many of us have a horse or a mule in our backyard for this purpose.
Which is a
So
shame.
uh, now, if you don't find high clay and a thick layer of it, then I suggest purchasing an aquatic safe liner. But mark the perimeter of the wetland you want to build, like with wire flags, or even use solo cups that are turned upside down. Mark the perimeter and then measure it. And then you can go online and find a pond supply store that would supply you with the aquatic safe liner. If you go to a big box store and buy a liner, more than likely to be treated with chemicals and it will kill all life in your water. So you want this aquatic safe liner, and then you really have to look on how to build one of these. You need some tools to help you. I recommend renting a laser. Even if you build a small one, we don't have the skill to set that top edge of the liner so it's level. When you are building a wetland with a liner, think about putting a bowl in the ground. If that top edge isn't level, you're going to have a low edge and it's going to leak. And I've seen people spend a lot of money on liners and that top edge isn't level and they end up building a pond or a wetland maybe 1/10 the size it should be. Then, of course, read and watch the videos that I have posted. We're going to have a number of videos on how to build using liners. The size is not that important. If it's very small and you have trees around, you'll probably have to rake the leaves out each year. Now, of course, with natural wetlands, we don't do any raking of leaves. But if you build a little wetland in your backyard, it will probably fill with leaves. And probably in the spring, you'll need to remove those leaves by hand. Otherwise, it'll fill in. And landscaping, Many people will put a rim of rock around the wetlands. I've never seen a natural wetland with a rim of rock around it. I don't like to put a rim of rock around it. I can see some stepping stones, but I like to have a gradual slope. Don't build it like it's a hole in the ground. Build it like it's natural depression. Then if somebody falls in, they won't drown. People will say to me, well, you can drown in, 6 inches of water. And that's many times at schools, they'll say to me, we don't want a wetland because our students will drown in it. Well, you know what? If you ever given a child a bath and they slip in the tub, the first thing they do is raise their head above the water. The second thing they do is they find somebody else to watch them when they're taking a bath. But anyways, the thing is, you can drown in 6 inches of water if you pass out because you're on drugs. So if you pass out in a bathtub, you may drown in 6 inches of water, but you're not going to drown in 6 inches of water. If you have gradual slopes, there is no drowning risk. So when we build a wetland at a school, we never fence them because they're not considered a risk. They have gradual slopes. So think about gradual slopes, shallow depth. It doesn't have to be deep. Now, if you're building a koi pond, that's a different story. You can buy these things preformed out of plastic.
Yeah.
And then you can have all the rocks and all the fountains you want. But if you want a natural appearing wetland, it should have gradual slopes. It should have a soil bottom, and it should fill naturally with precipitation. Now, you can fill it artificially with a hose if you want, but then that chlorine's going to have to, vaporize. But I suggest, probably just filling it with, just letting the rain fill it. That's probably a better way to go.
Yeah.
And if you build a small wetland in your backyard, you could get crustaceans like clam shrimp and fairy shrimp. You can get salamanders, toads, and frogs using it. Definitely dragonflies. If it's in the sunlight, you'll have dragonflies coming in to lay their eggs. And some people I know have built beautiful, beautiful wetlands by hand. It may take them several days, but they get it. There are some cases where you may want to consider child labor and maybe hiring a couple of kids down the road and have them help you dig it.
I've got my nieces coming for the summer. I know what I'm going to put them to do.
Digging holes. Yes. Digging holes. Yes. I've read the book titled Holes.
Yes, that's a good one.
Ought to be learned. There's a lot of character to be built by digging holes, isn't
That's the spirit. And they'll get rewarded later on when they can catch frogs and who knows, maybe even go fishing there at some point.
Right. So yes, you can build one in your backyard. Again, I would check any zoning ordinances to make sure that your community will allow it. Keep it shallow, gradual slopes. Make sure you build it so it will hold water. And then if you have success doing that, then go to a larger one and a larger one. Now, some schools, we built as many as 6 wetlands, all different shapes and sizes, all different hydro periods, and then different classes come out and investigate and see what's living in the shallow water and see for yourself that the mosquitoes will not take over, that you have all these other mosquito predators, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, one wetland turns into 3,000, and then we're interviewing you in this podcast for your experience.
There you go. It works.
Tom, this has been an absolute joy. I have learned so much through your video series and from your books as well. Can you tell our listeners how they can find your website and this video series that you've mentioned a couple of times?
Okay, if you're interested in more information about how to build wetlands, please go to my website, which is www.wetlandrestorationandtraining.com. And you can go to my YouTube channel, which is Tom Biebighauser, TomBibighauser. On my website, you'll find both the videos as well as a listing of the books that I've written to help you design and build wetlands. And if you're really serious about this, you can enroll in a graduate level course that I teach at the University of Louisville. And this course is called Wetland Design. And it's a great course for people, engineers and non-engineers alike, about how to design and build wetland areas. And if you follow my website, you can attend a workshop that I teach on how to design and build wetland areas. Now, I have never built a wetland in Spain, and I would love to build a wetland with you in Spain. And I would be willing to volunteer my time to do this if you just let me know the next opportunity, but I would ask that you cover my travel cost, and we could have a workshop where people can come out and build a wetland in one day. Wouldn't that be great?
Tom, the hint has been very well taken over here. I promise you I'll be on the lookout for opportunities to get you out here and work on a wetland project with me. That would be an absolute dream of mine. And man, I can't thank you enough for your time and for all of the resources that you've put out there. It's really got me fired up. I can't wait to integrate this into the services and the things that I help with my clients and our farm network as well. Thank you so much.
Well, let me know about the wetlands that you build, the wetlands you're designing. I'm happy to help you out. And this is really great of you to host this podcast. And I hope that encourages the listener to get out there and to build a wetland area.
Thanks once again to Tom. Based on his generous offer to come out to our region of Western Europe in order to assist and teach on wetland design and construction, I'm now on the lookout for the right project to bring him out here for. So if you're involved with any scale of landscape restoration project in Spain or Portugal and think that the addition of a wetland environment could help you to reach your goals for the project, I would encourage you to reach out to me through our contact form on the website at regenerativeskills.com. Now, it's important to know that we will be giving priority to potential projects that are open to running their project as an educational initiative with careful documentation and monitoring for multiple years. We're looking for something small to mid-range in size in order to be able to complete the install in a couple of days. And it's important to know that though we always work with clients to reduce costs and overhead, please don't reach out expecting a 100% free service. Appropriately researched and designed ecological installations are a valuable investment in a bespoke and an artisan service that will pay incalculable returns as they mature over time, and they should be considered as such. So for the rest of you, look out in the near future for workshops on wetland installation and other water retention landscape techniques in the very near future. And you can stay up on all the earliest news through our social media accounts in the meantime. Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account at regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.